Okay, welcome to Lesson 7. Lesson 7 is all about working with dynamic type treatments, and this is going to involve a lot of work with Illustrator's effects and maybe a few filters, and also we'll focus a lot on working with the appearance palette as well. So I've gone and opened up the next project file, which is called soundeffects.ai. That's soundfx.ai, and that's located inside the project files folder on your desktop, inside the Part 1 folder, inside the Lesson 7 folder. So go ahead and open up that file, and you'll see that we have a few comic book-like sound effects here that we'll be putting some dressing on in just a moment. Now, before we get to messing around with our different sound effects that I've created here for us, I want to give you sort of a basic run-through of working with effects, working with filters, and also working with the appearance palette. You may have done some of this already on your own, or this could be brand new for you. I don't know. So let's take a look. Yet again, give yourself some empty space to work in here, and I will start off in the most simplistic way that I know. I'm going to hit the D key on my keyboard. That gives me my default fill and stroke. I'll grab my rectangle tool, and all I want you to do is just draw a simple box on your screen. That's it. And then go ahead and grab a fill color if you like, whatever fill color is to your liking. And back to my black arrow tool, there's just a regular basic Illustrator object, no big deal. There's no mustard on it just yet. Make sure you highlight it there, and I want to discuss for a moment here the difference between working with Illustrator's effects and working with Illustrator's filters. Now, at first, when I first started messing around with effects and filters, I didn't understand why is Illustrator giving me the same set of commands in two different menus. I didn't understand that. For example, I can add a drop shadow through my filter, or I can add a drop shadow through an effect. What's the difference? Same with my arrowheads and so on. At first, I thought Illustrator was just being redundant, but there's actually a major difference between the filters and the effects. What's the difference? Well, filters in Illustrator are permanent. Once you go and put a drop shadow onto an object, and I'm going to go ahead and choose Filter, Stylize, Drop Shadow, I get my drop shadow dialog box, and I'll just take the defaults here, and as soon as I hit OK, I get my drop shadow in Illustrator. It looks pretty cool, but that's it. I can't do anything to this. Maybe if I wanted to make a change to my drop shadow, if I wanted to increase or decrease the blur, for example, there's nothing I can do about it. I can't go back to filter and back to stylize and back into drop shadow and then make some kind of a change. If I do this, Illustrator won't take my changes. So filters are permanent. In other words, I'm going to undo my drop shadow here. And instead of working with a filter, I always work with effects. In fact, I can't even remember the last time I used a filter in Illustrator. I'm always using effects. Why? Because effects, they're actually known as live effects, are always editable. And I'm going to give you a very simple example here. We'll use our drop shadow example. So I'm going now Effect, Stylize, and then down to Drop Shadow. And of course, I've already highlighted my object in the background. I get the same dialog box that I just had a moment ago, except, and this is a little bit of icing on the cake here, I get a preview checkbox. So now I can see what I'm going to get before I commit to it. I'll just move my drop shadow dialog box out of the way for a moment, and then I can come into my options here and begin messing around with, for example, my blending modes and my opacity and so on and so on. My X and Y offset. That's the horizontal offset and the vertical offset from the object there. That's what that's doing. And then also my blur. Maybe I want a very hard drop shadow. Maybe I want something like this. There we go. And I click on OK. And you might say, well, that's all well and amazing, but it's pretty much the same thing that we just had a moment ago with the filter. Well, that's not actually true. Go and grab your appearance palette. If you don't have your appearance palette open over on the right side of your screen, head up to your window menu and go and grab it. And like we saw in the previous lesson, the appearance palette tracks all of the settings that are going on inside my various Illustrator objects. So with my green rectangle selected here, I can see that it's a 1-point stroke. It's got a green fill, and aha, there's a drop shadow here. I would not have seen this here had I used the drop shadow filter. As you saw in the last lesson, these live effects are always editable. In fact, there's the tooltip right there telling me what I can do. I double click on it, brings me back in here, and I say, you know what, I do want a bit of a blur on it. I'll go to a 10-point blur. I'll turn on my preview, and there's my blur in the background. Hit OK. And everything's good back in Illustrator. So that's the difference between filters and effects. They might seem a little bit redundant at first, but that's the major difference. Filters are permanent, effects are always editable. And you know what? Here's what I love the best. I have my green rectangle selected. I go, I don't want to drop shadow anymore. So I grab this guy, I drag it down to the trash can in the appearance palette, and I'm back to my regular plain old Illustrator object. Pretty cool stuff. The only other thing I'll mention before we move along, I'll grab my green rectangle here again, back up underneath my effect menu. Because I just applied the drop shadow, Illustrator remembers the last effect that I used, and I have two options available here. I have apply drop shadow and drop shadow. What's the difference? Well, if I go drop shadow, I get the dialog box coming back up here, and I can turn on preview and then go and fiddle around with my options. So that was choosing effect and then drop shadow. Or what I could do is I could bypass the dialog box and just say, you know what, just apply the drop shadow using the last settings that I had used. So there it is, just effect and then drop shadow. Okay, so I'll go back to my appearance palette, highlight my drop shadow here and drag it down to my trash can to get rid of it, going back to a plain Jane Illustrator object here. What other neat and amazing effects can you use in Illustrator? There are literally tons of them. And the cool thing with Illustrator's live effects is it's quite literally a bottomless pit. You can keep playing and playing and playing and achieve all kinds of neat, amazing results. Let me show you a couple of cool ones here. I still have my object selected in the background. I'm going to go up to the Effect menu, down to Distort and Transform, and here's a fun one, Pucker and Bloat. There's my Pucker and Bloat dialog box. I always turn on my preview here, and then I can use my little slider here to move my arrow towards bloat or back over to pucker. So pucker over on the left, bloat over on the right. Maybe I want some kind of I'm thinking of St. Patrick's Day here. I'll do something like this, and then I'll click on OK. Now here's the other difference between a filter and an effect. And this is a bit of a mental leap here, especially if you're used to working with traditional Illustrator objects. In traditional Illustrator, these lines that I see here would be paths, and paths, of course, are connected by anchor points, but that is not what's happening here. In fact, you can see my blue selection frame showing up here. What the heck is going on? Try this. Let's go into our outline mode, and I'll show you exactly what's happening. So I'm going to hit Control-Y, Command-Y on the Mac, and what the heck? I still have a rectangle. So this is what Illustrator is seeing. I'll hit Command-Y or Control-Y again. To go back to preview, this is what I see. Illustrator, me. Illustrator, me. So as you can see, this is a live effect, but I still have my original object sort of sitting in the background. And that's what I mean by it being a bit of a mental leap to sort of wrap the melon around this concept. But it's pretty cool stuff. You can do all kinds of amazing things. Let's try something else.